welcome to this panel. My name is Peter Adkison, and I am the owner of Gen Con. If you haven't heard of it, Gen Con is the biggest convention for tabletop gaming in North America. It's held every year in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is kind of in the middle of the country, if you will. And this year will be our 45th year. It was started in 1967, so it's been around a long time. So if you ask the question, how do you build a great convention? Well, there's one way, 45 years. So if you're patient, yes, it's possible. So what the topic of this panel is, Gen Con, then and now. So I brought some pictures of, now I'm powering down. Okay, let's not do that. Hopefully I catch it quick enough, it comes right back. Most of these pictures, by the way, are taken from a book called 40 Years of Gen Con by Atlas Games. You could probably find it at a used seller of online books, I'm sure. So if you're interested in this topic and want to hear more of the stories and the history of this convention, that book will give it to you. I obviously was not at Gen Con in 1967. my first Gen Con was in 1992, so most of this history I'm not really qualified to present, but I did read the book. And I did assemble these photos, and I know a lot of the people that are mentioned in here. So I will try and represent as well as I can. I want to thank Randy Porter, is an unsung hero of this. He maintains a website, and if you do a Google search on history of Gen Con or something, he calls himself the keeper of ancient Gen Con lore, and he maintains this wonderful website which has pictures of all the program books, way more pictures that are in the book, going clear back to the beginning. He has copies of all the original program books and all sorts of memorabilia, and he's one of those fans that as a convention organizer, you just love, or as a business person, you just love it when you have a fan like this who will put all this work into preserving history. Because when you're running a business, you usually don't take time, unfortunately, to think about this sort of thing. So anyway, I will try to do as good a job as I can. I'll show you lots of pretty pictures, and then at the end I have a bunch of kind of pictures that are kind of more contemporary of Gen Con life, and a lot of this stuff will look familiar. I was just set on a panel, I think some of you were here, about convention organizers, and one thing I was struck by during the panel was how really there's a lot of similarity, more similarities than differences between conventions in the United States or here. Almost everything that the other people on the panel said I could relate to. And so I think that gamers, I've had a wonderful life of being able to travel the world and play games with people from now Finland, Italy, Brazil, Tokyo, all of the United States, Mexico, Canada, you name it, and throughout Europe. And the gaming community is so loving and so fun. It is very much an international community. And Gen Con, at its heart, is like Ropecon. It is a bunch of people who come together to play games and look at art and buy new product and go to panels and do all the things that you do. It's very similar. It's just Gen Con's been around a lot longer, so it's had the opportunity to get a lot bigger. So, all right, let me dive into some pictures, and join me in walking down memory lane, because I actually get a little emotional at this stuff. This is the history of Gen Con, is the history of tabletop gaming, because where did it really start? Well, it depends on how far back you want to go. I mean, H.G. Wells did Little Wars back in the 1920s or whatever, but I think the wargaming, I think our roots come out of wargaming. And I'm talking about the miniatures. Back before fantasy entered the picture, it was little toy soldiers, World War II, tanks, artillery, American Civil War, ancient wars of the the Persians or whoever, right? I mean, just these types of wargaming. And Gen Con, even though it was started by Gary Gygax, who is famous for inventing Dungeons and Dragons, or co-inventing it with Dave Arneson, this was 6 years before he did that. He started Gen Con before role-playing games were conceived of. So he started it as a wargaming convention. And Gen Con, what is now called Gen Con Zero, was held in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, in his home. And so in the previous convention panel, when they asked about how do you start a convention, do it on a budget. Well, Gen Con started in Gary's home. About 50 people showed up. It was just on the weekend because his wife wouldn't let it go longer than that. And there was no budget. Everybody brought their own food, which gave me an idea. If I was going to do a new convention, I might call it Barbecue Con and just start it at the park, It's like a flash mob. Everybody show up on this certain day, bring your own food, and bring your own games, and we'll play until the authorities kick us out. I don't know, So it's these fun beginnings that become stories and legends and traditions of the event. So this is as his house looked, I think, in the about 5 or 6 years ago, and this is where it started. This is where Gary Gygax lived in Lake Geneva for about 2 or 3 decades, I believe. This picture is also taken a little bit later. Gary's wife said, "No, you're not doing that again." The next year, Gen Con, or Gen Con 1, which may have been the first Gen Con, depending on how you want it, which side you want to take, was held in a little community center in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, called Horticulture Hall. Now, Lake Geneva is a very small town. If it wouldn't be for Dungeons and Dragons, you would never have heard of Lake Geneva. Unless you lived in sort of the Midwest, there's a lake there. Now, lakes are not as common as there is in Finland, although there's quite a few of them if you go to Minnesota, a little ways away. But Lake Geneva is a resort town. It's like you go to this town by the lake, and in the summer it fills up with like 100,000 people, and the rest of the year it's like 10,000 people, that sort of place. So that's just kind of give you an idea of what this place is like. So Horticulture Hall is a community center, and he rented that for $50 for the weekend, and had about 50 people, same as before, and each person chipped in $1, and they broke even. That was Gen Con 1's, the budget for Gen Con 1. And again, this picture was taken a little bit later, but it's the same building, and what the inside of Horticulture Hall looked like, and this is where Gen Con got its start. This is the oldest known photo of anybody gaming at Gen Con. This photo is taken in 1968, and the guy on the left there, Mike Carr, is the only person who is alive who has been to every Gen Con, and he's also run a game at every Gen Con, and he's run the same game at every Gen Con. And yeah, it is, and the game's called Dawn Patrol. It's an old miniatures. Obviously, miniatures were the only category then, so it's a miniatures game of World War I air combat, and it's become a classic, the Mike Carr Dawn Patrol game. And there's another game, Fight in the Skies, which was popular. For some reason, they love to play the airplane games. In 1969, here again we have Mike Carr, and he's and I have no idea what they're playing, but look how young everybody looks, right? Most of these guys, the ones that I know now, look a lot older. Actually, Mike Carr, I was afraid to meet him a few years back. I'd heard there was this legendary guy. I'd never met him even after going to Gen Con for like 15 years, unfortunately. I mean, that's how big it is. And so I said, well, I want to meet this guy, so it got set up, and I was expecting a really old geezer. And but he started so young that he's in great shape. I mean, he's going to be there for another 20, 30 years doing Dawn Patrol. I mean, this is going to become an increasingly wonderful tradition of Gen Con, you know. And isn't that what this is made of? I mean, you know, you have it here at Ropecon. You have traditions of community, of us as gamers coming together. And that is why you come, is reconnect with the tribe, reconnect with the clan, and share these traditions and share the old stories and add to them as time goes by. So I know a lot of these names of places won't mean anything to you, but they're very special to the people that were there. And you can imagine the corollary stories from your own life and from your own convention, and appreciate that these types of stories are happening all over the world and are strengthening us as a global community of people who love games. At least that's my opinion. 1970, one of the big games in early Gen Cons was Diplomacy. Diplomacy was an early board game to hit. And how many people know Diplomacy? I mean, wow, okay, yeah, I don't have to tell you what Diplomacy is. Did you realize it was this old? Yeah, I mean, it's been around a long time, and it is one of the best games ever designed in terms of its elegance. Not necessarily for keeping friends, but I think there are very few games who establish such a clear objective of this is what this game is about, and then delivers on that objective in such an elegant way. What an amazing game. And that beauty was not lost on this early crowd. They played, Diplomacy was a very popular game. So, I don't know, I know this is the land of LARPs here in Scandinavia. I don't know if this qualifies, but in 1970, there was something called the Seven Internation Simulation. And it would be hard for me to explain why this wasn't a LARP. It was very much a GM'd, everyone playing roles of diplomatic personas in dealing with international incidents. And this, there's an event now, it has been for a number of years, called the National Security Decision Making Group, which if you ever go to Gen Con and you like LARPing, I highly recommend it. It's one of the flagship events at Gen Con, and since LARPing is so popular in this community. So here's a picture of them doing exactly that in 1970. 1971, see this guy here with his head bent down, looking very, obviously studying a very important problem. It's Dave Arneson, co-designer of Dungeons & Dragons, and they're playing Napoleonics, of course. So here's a bunch of younger gamers playing Rising Sun. This is a miniatures game whose rules go back to the 1930s. Wow. Yeah. Okay, well that was phase one of Gen Con. In 1973, as we all have heard of this game called Dungeons & Dragons, which was really grew out of a game called Chainmail, which was a fantasy miniatures game by Gary Gygax and Jeff Perrin, who and then that led to this idea of a group of individuals breaking off from the main army and going through a dungeon into a castle called Blackmoor, and that led to the idea of a role-playing game, and this got fleshed out. And I certainly have never played detective enough to know exactly who deserves how much credit, but it's certainly clear that both Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson played very important roles in developing this. And then Gary Gygax went off to start a whole company around it. And so one would think, looking back, that probably at this point Dungeons & Dragons exploded and took over Gen Con. Actually, it had kind of a slow start, really. I mean, it came on the scene and started to grow, but it did not immediately eclipse the wargaming scene. The wargaming scene was pretty deeply entrenched. And there's about the next few years, 1973 to about 1977, I think, is you're just going to see a nice steady increase of Dungeons & Dragons. not yet really recognized for being cool, but not yet really recognized for being as amazingly cool as it would turn out to be. So let's follow along. 1976, the first big guest of honor at Gen Con. Well, you've probably figured out. I got those little titles in the upper left corner. Fritz Lieber, who big fantasy author. First time we had somebody. He came to Gen Con, and if you're a fan of Fafford and the Grey Mouser and the Lankmar series, you know who he is, and plus many other credits. And I know Gary Gygax was very, very proud to have him at the show. And here's the oldest picture that I have, at least, of Gary Gygax on the left, 1976, with Walt Buchanan of Diplomacy World. Brothers in Arms there. So 1976 was the year that Europeans took notice of Gen Con, the Brits especially, in particular. They had a small little company called Games Workshop with Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, not the one of GURPS fame, but the one of British fame, started distributing. That Games Workshop started as essentially a distributor for Dungeons & Dragons. They were fans of the game, and I'm not going to say much more than that because there's a lot of history there I don't know, and I'm sure there's much more to the story. But the Brits got very excited about Dungeons & Dragons very early on, and it was becoming a deal in the UK. And so Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson decided that they had to come to Gen Con because now Gen Con was starting to get talked about. People were starting to talk about, hey, have you heard of Dungeons & Dragons? If you haven't, you should check it out. And oh, by the way, there's this convention. You can go there and you can find out find out everything you need to know. So people were starting to show up from overseas. And they're here also an early photo, 1976. On the left, Fritz Lieber, Gary Gygax, M.A.R. Barker, who unfortunately just passed away this last summer, who did Empire of the Petal Throne, who was an anthropology teacher from Memphis, I think. Ian Livingstone, Rob Kuntz, and Steve Jackson. Old veterans that all of us owe something to. At least I certainly feel that way, for having helped us get to where we are. Another picture of M.A.R. Barker presenting Empire of the Petal Thrones, 1976. Program books were pretty simple back then. These program books from 1976, 1977. Horticulture Hall. Now, you might know this program book, 1977, Playboy Resort in Lake Geneva. So Gen Con was starting to get pretty big. Big enough. We were outgrowing Horticulture Hall, but determined to stay in Lake Geneva. I say we. I certainly wasn't there, but and the place they found that was big enough to host Gen Con and stay in Lake Geneva was the Playboy Resort in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. So Gen Con was held here, Playboy bunnies and all. I don't. I have a. There's the inside of the hall, but unfortunately, she is not wearing a bunny outfit that I can tell. Yeah, so that's a shame that they don't have the bunnies serving the gamers. That would be a good. Well, this I think Gary really liked this idea, but it did not go over well with the crowd at large, and that happened one time and one time only, and it was talked about with embarrassment for many years after, until enough time had passed that everybody could laugh about it. And so again, far before my time. Let's see, I missed one slide here. TSR was starting to become a reasonably sized company, I think maybe 20 employees by now. And this is a building which is also a hotel. They rented the offices. It's a multi-purpose building, part hotel, part Q-tip factory, and part TSR offices. Oh, and part, there was a knitting company there too. 1978, Dungeons & Dragons is in full gear by now. It's still not a mainstream word of mouth, but it is definitely securely in the ranks, and it's really starting to find its stride. Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax here at this point by now had severed ties with Dave Arneson, and in an attempt to try and differentiate where Dungeons and Dragons was going from Dave's original work, rebranded it as Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, came out with the Player's Handbook soon after the Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and these would become the three primary, the core books, if you will, of Dungeons and Dragons, and many other role-playing games that have copied that formula. And there it is. I still have mine, and boy, is it beat up, and boy, it's probably my most prized possession, and mine was from 1978. When this book came out, a personal story. Now I finally have a personal connection to this story. I was living in. I wasn't living in Seattle yet. I was living in a smaller town, still in the state of Washington, up in the northwest corner of the United States. And I was in high school. And a friend of mine and I drove all night to Seattle and stood in line because the only store in the state that carried this book was American Eagle's in Seattle. And we had to drive about 300 miles, Walla Walla to Seattle, 250. Yeah, so we drove all night, got there, waited in line. There were 200 gamers in line at this store when it opened to buy the Player's Handbook. And we got there in time to get ours. And we were very proud of that. Just in case you're kind of wondering where the hell all these places are, here's a map of the United States. All these places we're talking about are kind of in the middle, near Chicago. Now, just for reference, I live way up in the upper left-hand corner in Seattle, just so I have a little framework here. And so now zeroing in on the area around Chicago, you see Chicago on the left. The left-hand bubble there, teardrop, I guess, is Lake Geneva. That's where Gen Con started. And it is, after 1977, the Playboy Bunny situation, the next year they decided they needed to move to a larger venue. So in 1978, they moved to the University of Wisconsin, a college campus. Very similar, I suspect, to the situation you have here. College facilities. And that's, if you just move directly to the right between Kenosha and Racine, is where the University of Wisconsin is. Later, in 1985, they will move to Milwaukee. Gen Con moved to Milwaukee. And then 2003 to Indianapolis. So kind of gives you, and in the bigger picture of the United States, it's all kind of the same area. But you could see why there's some people that were a little upset that we moved all the way down to Indianapolis. Yeah, that was controversial. Okay. So, University of Wisconsin at Parkside, academic environment, halls and buildings and chairs, gamer chairs. I wish I had a picture of them filled with gamers, but I don't. The program books from 1978 up to, I'm having trouble reading it, 1984. These are the Parkside University of Wisconsin years. And let's see, is this the one? Well, they're starting to call it a game convention. There's a one I missed earlier, I think 1976, 3 years after Dungeons & Dragons it came out, the program book still calling it a wargaming convention, which I always thought was an interesting one. Oh no, 77, the year Fritz Lieber was there. 1979 is the year that the awareness of Dungeons & Dragons exploded in the United States in the public awareness of everybody. Everybody in the United States learned what Dungeons & Dragons was, or what they thought. They heard the name Dungeons & Dragons that year. There's a guy named James Dallas Egbert who was, well, I mean, we're used to this story by now. Some misguided youth who, mad at the world or upset, whatever, goes out and is a lost soul. Well, this guy disappeared for a period of time, and because he played Dungeons & Dragons, the authorities blamed it on Dungeons and Dragons. Eventually, he was found. He admitted that it had nothing to do with Dungeons and Dragons, and in fact, Dungeons and Dragons was the one good thing happening in his life. But in that week or so of his disappearance, it was the search for this kid was on national media, and this was the best thing that ever happened for Dungeons and Dragons. This was a case of bad media being great for sales, because all over the United States, parents are going, "Oh my God, that's evil," and the kids are going, "Oh, parents think this is evil, huh? Sounds interesting to me." And that's the God's honest truth. That's exactly the way it happened. It was the excitement of doing something that your parents would disapprove of, spurred sales into a whole another level. And this is when this is the beginning of the big phase of the roller coaster ride of fame that Dungeons and Dragons would be known for. And Gen Con was along for the ride. Gen Con became the gravitational center of the games industry. As Dungeons and Dragons became bigger, role-playing games became bigger than miniatures and wargaming. As Dungeons and Dragons became the most popular game ever in the history of hobby games, the Gen Con became the flagship for the company that was doing this, TSR. TSR is the publisher of Dungeons & Dragons, also the owner, because Gary Gygax did both, so naturally they both ended up in the same company. So everybody started, and TSR wisely allowed everybody else to come to this convention. I mean, that seemed like a natural decision, but it wasn't necessarily an obvious decision. You certainly could have, there's certainly a point in time where they could have said, hey, this is our convention, and what we want to do is promote our products. Why would we let anybody else come and promote their products as well? But if they would have done that, it would have divided. But because they didn't do that, and they encouraged other companies to come and show their products as well, it helped the financial viability of the convention. It helped draw more attendance to the convention. And everybody realized that the place to launch a new game in the hobby game industry was at Gen Con. And this was figured out as early as 1979. And almost every famous game that's come out in the American market since then has been launched at Gen Con. So 1979, Traveler. Miniatures are still a big part of what's happening at Gen Con. This picture from 1980 shows what was called the biggest damn miniatures battle ever, or best damn miniatures battle ever. I don't know, something like that. This became a tradition at Gen Con. LARPs. I had to throw this in because I know it's popular here. LARPs had kind of a rocky start with Gen Con. There were early problems with LARPs, and Gen Con management decided that they didn't quite know how to deal with it. The concern that they had with LARPs is that the media would come and focus all their attention on anybody in a costume, and the public was just too sensitive to that at that day and age. It was now nobody would care. They'd say, "Oh, that's cute," right? But in 1980, this was too risque for the company, according to management. So LARPs were outlawed at Gen Con for many years. There were no LARPs. 1981, Champions. 1988, Cyberpunk. 1982, Killer, which is a LARP, really. Also Assassin, Steve Jackson Games. The Star Frontiers, also 1982, at TSR. Manufactured a robot to go around and produce Star Frontiers. Really pissed off Scott Bizarre of Fantasy Games Unlimited, who had launched a science fiction game the same year. And the TSR robot would go in front of his booth and talk about how the other game was shit. And Scott Bizarre never came back to Gen Con after that. So, some of the management of Gen Con in various years was a bit heavy-handed, we'll say. It's not like that anymore. 1985, D&D is really close to its first wave peak. You know, I don't know sales numbers precisely back then, but this is about when this is getting close to the top of the wave. But Gen Con has really gotten big by now. All the game companies are coming and exhibiting. All these games I'm showing you pictures of are from all categories are coming, and the convention once again has outgrown its venue and had to move. So in 1985, Gen Con moved to an actual convention center, like you'd see for a big trade show, the Mecca Convention Center, which, what a great name for that's the hardest part about leaving Milwaukee, was leaving the Mecca Center, because, well, anyway, and the Safe House Bar, but we'll get to that. So moving to Wisconsin, 1985, Hotel Wisconsin. Wisconsin's kind of a charming town. It's a home for beer, and it's known for beer. I think Laverne and Shirley was set in Wisconsin. What's that? Did I say something? I said Milwaukee. Oh, yeah, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm sorry. Yeah, the city, Milwaukee, in Wisconsin. 1985, Pendragon released. I don't think it's this edition of Pendragon, though. But that's the year the original Pendragon came out. And one of the cool things about Milwaukee is there's a bar. Anybody here ever been to the Safe House? Is it even one? Oh, well, that's one little part of gaming history that has come and gone. There was a bar in Milwaukee called the Safe House, which was an immersive spy-themed bar where they had all these tricky things. And this was a favorite. And this bar would just sell out to the max when Gen Con came to town. It was the biggest weekend of the year. It had secret rooms. It had there was a telephone booth. You could go in and dial a certain number. If you dialed the right number, a secret door would open, and it would let you exit the facility through the steam tunnels underneath the bar. When you came to the bar, the entrance to the bar was not a bar. It was something that would sound like a James Bond safe house. In fact, it was called a safe house, right? And it was something like International Distribution, or something just really boring sounding name, and it looked like an office. And you go up there, and there'd be somebody there. And, of course, they're going to let you in anyway, because that's a business. They won't let you in. But if you had to know the password, and the password was, I'm looking for a safe house. And if you said the password, they'd let you in, no problem. If you didn't say the password, then they would make you do a bunch of silly things, like dance with pom-poms, or go around in circles, or whatever, and then they let you in. And when you got in, you found out that all this stuff was being up on the TV. So all your friends that were there already got to see you do this, right? And inside there'd be people doing card tricks and all sorts of wonderful stuff. I think this speaks to the importance in our community of having common areas. Anybody have any questions about this period? I could try and answer them best I could. Yes? So this is about 10,000 attendees in the mid-'80s. Yeah. And probably about 100 exhibitors in the dealer's hall. Is there another question over here? Yes, sir. I think it is there. Yes. I don't know. I haven't been back to Milwaukee since we left. I heard it fell on hard times without us. That we were literally a big part of the economy. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If you ask anybody, now maybe somebody from TSR in those days might disagree. There was certainly an attempt to have some level of customer service to the competitive companies, but there were some things that other companies found very egregious. For example, TSR always got the middle location of the exhibit hall, and no other company was allowed to have their stands above a certain height, so that TSR booth could be bigger than any other booth. So yeah, I'd say that's an you know, they didn't even really try and hide the fact that they were giving that this was their show, and they were doing you a favor by letting you come and exhibit at their show, and they were doing you a favor by letting you play other games. Yes. Yes, absolutely. In fact, if I'm not wrong, Fantasy Trip grew into GURPS, right? I mean, it's Steve Jackson. I think he had other collaborators. I can't really remember. By the way, I loved Fantasy Trip. I thought it was a fabulous game. But and then some of the small micro games. But yeah, Steve Jackson was Fantasy Trip were active exhibitors at Gen Con up to a point. Now at some point. I don't know. At some point, somebody at Gen Con or TSR pissed him off, and he quit coming back. I think he was quite active back in those days. There was also because of this, because TSR was a bit competitive to their Gen Con customers. That really gave a lot of rise to the formation of the Gamma Trade Association, which started as a sort of all the other companies saying we need to band together and form an industry association to talk about industry issues. And TSR did not attend this. And then also the Origins Convention, which the Gamma Trade Show supported as essentially an alternative to Gen Con. And I think that gave Origins a lot of support in the early years, because there was just this desire to make sure that Gen Con wasn't the only party. Program books in Wisconsin early years started now to become more colorful, more professional. Here we're now coming in from the late 80s towards the early 90s. Some more. You mentioned Fantasy Trip. Here we have GURPS, Starfleet Battles. Two more examples of games launched at Gen Con, 1986, 1979, respectively. By the late 1980s, you're seeing, oh, okay, 5 minutes, okay. Ars Magica, Shadowrun. Okay, this convention, we just renamed the panel, Gen Con Then, instead of Gen Con Now and Then. And here we are, the Mecca Hall. Now we are in Wisconsin. Let me, this was in Bruce Hall. This is how they did the role-playing rooms in the Wisconsin pipe and drape rooms to help baffle the noise. Early 90s, the appearance of the famous chainmail bikinis started coming back to the convention. LARPs were allowed back in. 1992, Cthulhu for President. I think one of perhaps the best promotional campaign for a product line ever in the history of games. Cthulhu for President. Why vote for the lesser evil? Big rallies. I got that one sideways. I just couldn't help but throw in several pictures of that. It was so much fun. And okay, boy, this is a nice demonstration for. There's the TSR Castle. This was built in 1992, and immediately led to a Nerf war. And okay, I've got to get to. I think I'm almost there. Okay, but the other cool thing that happened in 1992, really starting to see the new breed of games. White Wolf launches Vampire the Masquerade. And another company makes its first appearance on the public scene, Wizards of the Coast. That's Lisa Stevens there in the middle. And that was our booth that looked like a little castle. Isn't that cool? And that's me, 1992, with the castle background walls. And 1993, launch of Magic the Gathering. and we and then Gen Con just takes a very it really becomes, I think, after 1993, Gen Con really feels like, and the gaming industry really starts to feel more and more as a multi-category industry, where role-play games, because also what happened in the 90s is board games really came into their own. Games Workshop really got very big in the 1990s, plus the trading card games. LARPs came back, and throughout the 90s, you just see more and more art shows, Legend of the Five Rings, Deadlands, Ed Greenwood, his Elminster, the auction, Tracy Hickman's Killer Breakfast, a standing room only at his events, a great event at Gen Con, the Battletech Pods, the launch of 3rd edition in 1999, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson on the same panel near 2000, a rare moment, and it's time for me to quit. All right, thank you.
Ropecon.